So,
All right, so welcome back everybody who is here for the first session, and welcome everybody who is new here for the second session. So in this second session, we will address one of the central themes of the biomaterialities research group, that is how living nature is economically evaluated or valorized in the context of a high-tech bioeconomy. Biomaterialities explored how biotechnological and digital innovations are transforming practices of production, reproduction, and political regulation. Rather than a low-tech, localized use of biological resources, many current developments point towards a high financialized and technologically mediated bioeconomy driven by investment logics, innovation infrastructures, and narratives of sustainability. Today's session zooms in, no pun intended, on the role of venture capital, financial instruments, and startup economies in shaping bioeconomic innovations, and startup ecosystems in shaping this bioeconomic innovation. We ask how financial imperatives and valuation practices influence what is considered sustainable, what kinds of agri-food technologies are supported, and how socio-ecological inequalities may be reinforced in the process. Together, these three perspectives will help us to critically engage with the political economy of valorization in the bioeconomy, highlighting both its promises and its contradictions. And as in the previous session, we have two speakers, one an external guest, Ruth Sippel, and then Cornelius as part of the biomaterialities research, and then we have Peter Feindt as the commentator. So I will introduce them before their talks or comments. We begin with Ruth Sippel, who holds the chair in Economic Geography and Globalization Studies at the University of Münster. And she is a leading scholar in critical agrarian studies, farmland investment, and the financialization of nature, with a particular interest in how agri-food tech and digital farming technologies reshape land use and rural livelihoods. Her regional expertise spans Australia, the Mediterranean, and California. And about her academic background, she earned a PhD and Habilitation in geography at the University of Leipzig and has held numerous international research positions, including fellowships in The Hague, Brisbane, and Graz. Her talk today is entitled Techno-finance Fixes, Financializing Agri-Food through Startups and Venture Capital. Join me in welcoming Ruth Sippel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's really nice to be here and to learn more about the final outcomes of this research project that I've been following over the years with a lot of interest. And it's also great that it's online, actually, because that allows me to participate, even though being on maternity leave. So this is my baby here. If I'm rocking a little bit, I hope you don't get seasick. That's mostly to keep the baby asleep and hopefully make it through this session without her complaining about her working mother. All right. Okay, so I will try and share my presentation, which should work, hopefully. And we'll start straight into the topic. So if we believe the current agri-food tech talk, we are currently on the cusp of a global food revolution. Agri-food tech entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are eager to let us know that in the near future, virtually nothing about our food system will remain the same, as novel and innovative technologies disrupt every single aspect of how we produce, distribute, and consume food. The agricultural industry, we learn from reports such as the UBS report quoted here of 2019, is about to be disrupted and will transform into a high-tech industry with technological innovations changing the very fundamentals of how, where, and when we grow food. Indeed, over the past decade, the digitization of agri-food has picked up pace rapidly, and private investments in new digital agricultural and food technologies, startups have grown to previously unknown dimensions. Agri-food tech startups have raised over $200 billion of US dollars of venture capital over the past 10 years. Agri-food tech startups are mushrooming all over the world and promise solutions to a host of critical issues in the food system, ranging from climate change to plastic pollution to the inhumane treatment of animals. So how can we make sense of this recent agri-food tech hype, and specifically the agri-food narratives and imaginaries of food futures that are being produced within this discourse? In this short presentation here today, I would like to argue that startup companies, venture capital investment firms, and tech entrepreneurs together discursively construct a whole range of new technology-driven agri-food imaginaries. However, rather than just being random visions of possible food futures, these agri-food imaginaries need to be understood as financialized imaginaries, as they present current agri-food challenges and their desirable food future counterparts in ways that specifically target financial investors. They discursively construct, I would suggest, a techno-finance fix, proposing that the food system needs to be fixed through a combination of technological progress on the one hand and financialized means on the other. This techno-finance fix, I will then suggest, needs to be seen as part of the broader process of the financialization of agri-food, as we've seen it in recent decades. Following Sippel, I understand financialization here as a specific process of transforming the world, objects, organizations, and the problems we encounter by the introduction of financialized practices, theories, and instruments. This, amongst others, also includes particular ways of representing the world, constructing problems, suggesting solutions, and creating expectations, which are grounded in and speak to financial economic logics and needs. So in the remaining time of my presentation here, I would like to demonstrate how this techno-finance fix, as I call it, is discursively constructed, and then I will sum it up with a few key points as to what I think this means for the future of food. In doing this, my argument is based on critical discourse analysis of investment and industry reports, self-representations, and thought pieces produced by some of the leading actors of this new emerging agri-food tech investment space, including the analysis of reports, brochures, websites, and webinars, amongst others. So this techno-finance space unfolds in three main steps, which I will walk you through here by using some of the quotes from this discourse. First off, we can find a presentation of a food system in crisis. As you can read in this quote here from the Grow Impact Fund, for example, there is a need to revolutionize our global food system, and this has never been more critical. Besides significant production challenges brought about by climate change, the long-term effects of monocropping and changing consumer demands, and the simple fact of a rising population, all this together demands a new approach to how we produce our food. Similarly, also Agri-Novos here is arguing that we are approaching a tipping point in terms of our food system at the moment. Again, population growth is a main problem that is considered here, and the food systems are just becoming less viable for consumers and the planet, they are claiming. However, as Ag Funder, another main actor within the scene, argues here, current solutions to the food system are either toxic to people or to the people and the environment, or ineffective. So they conclude there really has to be something done. So as we can see here, there's first off a very strong suggestion that we are dealing with a food system that is in crisis. In terms of the solutions then that are being presented to this crisis, In the agri-food tech discourse, we can find a depiction of the necessity of technologically driven food futures. Again, as Grow Impact Fund argues, for example, we're being told that innovation is urgently required and technology will play a material role within this future transformation of the food system that we need. Similarly, Astonor Ventures argue that only highly disruptive, scalable new technology will bring about this new revolution, the revolution in the agri-food sector. And as the UBS report argues, there's the promise of widespread adoption of precision technology, which will allow farming then to become truly automated and factory-like with robots on the ground as well as in the air. In terms of the key actors identified as capable of achieving this fundamental change, these are entrepreneurs whose innovations will be, quote unquote, fundamental to addressing the problems, finding solutions for farmers, consumers, and the environment. And to sum it up, there is an intersection of technology and entrepreneurship claimed here, which will define the future of food and agriculture. So what we can find here is a very classic, so to say, techno fix as identified in 2013 by Morozov, where the positioning of technologies is seen as a solution to social problems. This techno fix here, that is the strong faith that technology adaptation and entrepreneurialism will act as saviors, as necessary and functional solutions for social, political, and cultural problems, is a major narrative that is very present throughout the agri-food tech discourse. However, the techno fix, as I argue, is only one side of the coin, as these techno-food futures are simultaneously touted as a tremendous investment opportunity, which then brings me to the finance fix. So in the agri-food tech discourse, it is precisely the problem, the food system in crisis, which makes agri-food at the same time also ripe for those disruptions that then offer huge investment opportunities for investors. So again, from the Grow Impact Fund, we can read here, as venture capitalists, we believe in the commercial opportunities that arise from investing in scalable solutions to address some of mankind's biggest challenges, namely to transform the food system. And the global agri-food industry requires an injection of capital far beyond what has happened so far. So there is very clearly this kind of positioning that we need financial capital, that this is necessary in order to achieve the necessary fix of the food system. And at the same time, within this, then investors are being promised to simultaneously be in a position to make huge profits from these very investments. So a quote here from the UBS report, they are promising that there is a vast untapped market that is available there. And with the rapid emergence of powerful technologies, they expect food innovation to become a $700 billion US market by 2030. So in sum, this combination of techno and finance fix here combines the dominance of a strong faith in technologies and technological determinism with the necessity of a financial approach to address these issues, namely via the means and instruments of the increasingly financialized global economy. The food system is thought to be fixed through the necessary juncture of both technological progress and financialized means of technology development and profit-making from these very technologies. So what does this mean then for the future of food? So far, just trying to move this forward. In the previous literature engaged with agri-food technologies, scholars have notably pointed to its inherent solutionism, promissory narratives, and non-disruptive disruptions. In this presentation, I, in turn, have emphasized specifically the financial component of the agri-food discourse. And this, I argue, sorry, that was the wrong slide, one earlier. This, I argue, is actually furthering the financialization or the broader financialization of the agri-food system as we've seen it since the early 2000s, basically. Since then, scholars have identified a financialization of agri-food in a number of areas, such as food retailing and agribusiness, agricultural derivatives trading, agricultural production, specifically of farmland, risk management, but also farmers' subjectivities in terms of farmers becoming much more financially literate, or at least there's this claim that they should become financially literate and consider themselves as financial subjects. So in addition to these areas, I suggest that what we're seeing here within this agri-food tech scene is an additional layer of financialization of the agri-food system, in the sense that now also our imagination of agri-food futures is becoming financialized, as well as the associated agricultural technology development. So to then come to my last slide and conclusions or observations here, recognizing that the agri-food imaginaries that are being produced in this agri-food tech discourse are actually financialized imaginaries, I argue is important in order to take them for what they are. Not real-life, everyday scenarios of our food future, but rather rhetorical means to attract investment for this new investment space. So rather than just being one element of this emerging scene, I suggest that the financial character is actually located at the very heart of the agri-food tech endeavor, making its analysis crucial for the understanding of these recent developments in agri-food. Studying imaginaries allows us to become aware of the role and purpose that imaginaries play within specific societal projects. They are never neutral, but closely intertwined with particular environmental or societal undertakings, such as here the transformation of the food system, and making it accessible to financialized means and goals of return and profit realization. Financialized imaginaries are geared towards envisioning future worlds in ways that make them accessible to financial investment and its logic of return generating mechanisms. We thus need to be careful to not misconstrue these imaginaries as realistic depictions of what our future or future food system in this case will look like. They do not necessarily provide us with a real-life, everyday scenario of what the future of food might become, but financialized imaginaries are rather part of the digitization project and not of its everyday realization, and should therefore not be mistaken as such. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm much looking forward to the dialogue with the two other presenters in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for keeping the time almost perfectly. So, which is something I can't claim for myself. So the second presentation will be given by my colleague Cornelius Heimstädt. Cornelius is a postdoctoral researcher in the biomaterialities group at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And he has previously held positions at the French National Center for Scientific Research and completed his PhD at the Center for the Sociology of Innovation at MINES in Paris. His research lies at the intersection of science and technology studies, economic sociology, and environmental sociology, with a strong focus on sustainability, finance, and digital innovation. In his talk, Pitching Sustainability, Integrating Environmental Concerns into a Career of Venture Capitalization, he will explore how ecological concerns are strategically packaged and performed in startup pitches as part of venture capital markets. So please welcome Cornelius.
Yes, thank you very much. A few words. I will be a little bit longer than 15 minutes because, as I already said, I had a little bit of like multitasking the last days, and actually my talk was 15 minutes as first, and then for some reason yesterday I thought it should be 30 minutes, so I extended it. Then I noticed that we only have 15, so I shortened it again, so it will be a little bit, but now I jump right into it. And I changed the title. Yeah, dear workshop participants, I'm very happy to be here and to present my current paper, which I plan to submit to the Journal of Cultural Economy later this month or next month. The working title is Pitching Sustainability in the Order of Venture Capitalization. And yeah, I would like to thank the Biomaterialities team, our guest speakers and discussants for making today's event possible. And I very much look forward to the discussion that follows. So let's jump right in. In 2007, Steve Jobs stood on stage in a black turtleneck and introduced the first iPhone, and this pitch constituted a revolution in telecommunications for many. And his pitch has since become a textbook example of how entrepreneurial self-presentation can influence both economic and technological development. Fast forward, nearly 2 decades later, and we now see a very different scene. A startup on the German TV show Die Höhle der Löwen, The Lion's Den, pitches a business model aimed at financing biodiversity measures on farmland. Again, the pitch is central, but the aesthetic and setting are vastly different. Instead of the sleek Apple stage, this pitch is closer to the children's farm in Berlin-Pankow, that I regularly visit with my nephews. What we are witnessing here is not a radical break, but a reconfiguration of startup pitches. Sustainability is increasingly being integrated into the pitch format, often through props that evoke natural qualities, such as plants or garden beds. Whereas hyper-stylized technological innovation once dominated entrepreneurial presentations, today themes of ecological responsibility and care have moved to the forefront, as epitomized in the pitch by Artenglück on the right. The central question of my paper is thus how sustainability enters the core format of the startup economy, the pitch, and what it tells us about the role of this economy in broader societal sustainability transformations. Before we answer this question, let me briefly outline the theoretical framework informing this study. I understand the valuation of startups in the context of pitches as a process of venture capitalization, a concept developed by Riom and Schneider, which is at the heart of the special issue in which this paper is set to appear. Venture capitalization refers to the process by which startups attract investment by managing expectations about their future value. Crucially, this value is not based on predictable rent flows, but on the anticipation of successive funding rounds and ultimately the prospect of a profitable exit, either through acquisition or an IPO. In this sense, venture capitalization is about projecting potential rather than stabilizing present returns. Now, there is a productive debate here that I'm having with the editors actually about the relative merits of venture capitalization versus the now more established concept or assetization, which is also very close to the concept of financialization we have heard about earlier, as proposed by scholars like Birch and Münster. Assetization refers to the transformation of things, technologies, services, even relationships into income-generating assets that are stabilized through legal, financial, or infrastructural devices. In contrast, venture capitalization emphasizes a more dynamic, expectation-driven mode of valuation. The relevance of either concept depends on an analytical decision, in my point of view. What exactly is being valued through the pitch? If we treat the pitch as a device to value the startup itself, then venture capitalization is the appropriate framework. But if we assume the pitch is about valuing a specific technology, which might retain value even if the startup doesn't exist anymore, then assetization might be more fitting. This distinction is crucial when pitches are aimed not only at investors, but also at users, partners, or startup ecosystem actors whose engagement boosts the value of the technology in question, allowing rent extraction even after acquisition, integration, or platform dominance. Against this background, I conceptualize the pitch as a capitalization device, drawing on the ANT-informed work of Duganova and Münster. In this view, the pitch is not just an immaterial narrative, it's a socio-material assemblage composed of slides, a stage, audiovisual props, narrative routines, and interactional constraints. It displays a formal coherence that reproduces and stabilizes the fragile process of venture capitalization, even if only temporarily. To understand what happens within this device, I turn to ethnomethodology. In Garfinkel's terms, venture capitalization is not an overarching structure. It's an order that is reproduced in practice. In this light, the pitch becomes a site of order production where entrepreneurs actively work to maintain the recognizability of their business proposition as a legitimate object of investment. Now, this is where sustainability enters the picture as a potential source of trouble. Drawing on recent work in economic sociology, I approach sustainability not as a neatly defined non-economic value that can simply be inserted into the VC-centered order of the pitch. And there are two interrelated reasons for this. First, a historical reason. Dominant interpretations of sustainability, like, for example, the Brundtland definition, have always considered sustainability as a mixture of distinct yet interdependent valuations, such as social, economic, and environmental. To treat sustainability then simply as a non-economic value would mischaracterize it. And second, from an economic sociology perspective, sustainability, depending on its interpretation, can point toward alternative forms of economization, such as degrowth, sufficiency, or also non-market goals. And these may conflict with the speculative, growth-oriented logic underpinning venture capitalization. In this sense, sustainability is not just a value to be integrated into the pitch, but a potentially disruptive element, one that must be carefully managed or even repaired in the performative context of the pitch. Thus, the situation entrepreneurs face is not just an intellectual puzzle, it's a practical interactional problem. They must perform a delicate balancing act, signaling a commitment to sustainability to attract investors without going too far and alienating them. In short, they must reconcile different, potentially conflicting valuations of their startup moment by moment in real time so as not to jeopardize its venture capitalization. This leads to the research question that guides my study. How do startups enact the sustainability of their own activity in pitches, and how are the tensions that arise within the VC-centric order of the pitch practically managed on stage? Before I answer this question, let me briefly describe my case and methods. My research is based on an ethnographic study I conducted at Agritechnica 2023, the largest agricultural trade fair in Germany, held under the theme of green productivity. And the fair attracted over 470,000 visitors. Of particular relevance to my study was the dedicated startup hall where 45 startups presented their technologies. Given the fair's green productivity theme, all of these startups made explicit reference to the ecological value of their innovations, although in varying tones, forms, and contents. To systematically analyze these qualitative differences, I collected three types of data: video recordings of all pitches, semi-structured interviews with founders and organizers, and supplementary materials like pitch decks, press releases, and trade fair documents. And for the sake of time, I will spare you my analytical process, but we could discuss that later on. The central results of my empirical analysis is the identification of three interactional methods, or ethno-methods in Garfinkel's terms, through which pitching entrepreneurs attempt to make sustainability compatible with the order of venture capitalization. The first of these interactional methods I call sustainabilization. This term refers to the ways in which specific keywords, evaluative logics, or symbols are employed in pitches to align sustainability claims, consciously or not, with dominant economic discourses that are deemed sustainable. These versions include precision, circularity, withdrawal, and investment. The second interactional method that I identified is credibilization. This term refers to a recurring pattern in which the farmer is presented as the ultimate authority on agricultural sustainability. This figure is often invoked as the source of credibility for sustainability claims by the startups. So the entrepreneurs tend to align their sustainability narratives with a somewhat idealized or stylized version of the farmer, but we will get to that later. And the third interactional method that I identified is labeled demonstration. And this term involves the ways in which material props are mobilized on stage to convey that a startup's technological solution to sustainability is either realizable or already in use. Demonstration operates on a spectrum between showing, so the performative display of technologies or photos or something like that, and proving, which means scientific, like delivering scientific evidence. With most startups engaging much more in the end of the spectrum that I call showing. Well, but this is only the overview. Let's go deeper into the data. Let's begin with the first ethno method I identified, which I call sustainabilization. As mentioned, this term describes how startups present their business practices as sustainable by aligning them with established sustainability discourses. The focus here is less on technical specifics and more on using keywords, evaluative logics, and symbolic cues to associate a particular version of economization with the business model at hand. The first example of this practice that I'd like to share comes from a startup that developed a so-called spot spraying technology, essentially a system that identifies weeds and sprays them selectively. In the pitch, the practice of sustainabilization became evident among other moments in the following excerpt, and I will read it out. In this chart, we can see that in the last 30 years, the use of herbicides has more than doubled. We wanted to offer a solution to the farmer. On the one side, we want to lessen the amount of chemicals that the farmer has to buy. And on the other side, we want to protect our environment. So today I'm here introducing our new project, and it's our spot spraying solution. You can basically detect the presence of a plant and spray just on top of the plant instead of the traditional blanket cover. The key message here is twofold and quite clear. The technology is designed to reduce costs while also protecting the environment. In this case, sustainability is framed through a logic of efficiency, a framing often encapsulated in precision agriculture by the formula producing more with less. What we can see then is the performative embedding of the startup into a discursively accepted vision of what counts as sustainable economic practice. And here on this side, there is a quote for a different version of sustainability, but I don't go into the details here for the sake of time. The only thing is kind of the synthesis with regard to this first interactional method of sustainabilization, which is that if we look at all the 45 pitches, we can see that there is a narrowing of potential interpretations of sustainability. So there are only 4 versions of sustainability that are being enacted. So the many other interpretations, let's say degrowth, to stick with a kind of an illustrative example, they're faded out, or they don't appear in the pitch. Yeah, and this is kind of the first learning with regard to this first interactional method of sustainabilization. So then we can move to the second method, which is a little, and the second method is credibilization. As mentioned, this refers to a recurring pattern in which startups lend credibility to their sustainability claims by enacting a heavily stylized or even cliched figure of the farmer as the ultimate authority on agricultural sustainability, and then aligning their own position with the presumed viewpoint of that figure. This dynamic becomes particularly evident in the following quote from a so-called carbon farming startup. Again, I read out the quote. And we can do this very good, I think, because we have a lot of farmers in our team. I myself am a farmer, and a lot of my colleagues are, and everybody who is talking to farmers has a background in agriculture. That's something that is unique in the space, and we are very capable of taking the farmers seriously and are taken seriously by the farmers. I've chosen this quote because it nicely illustrates the two-step method of credibilization I observed in many of the pitches. First, a generic figure of the farmer is introduced as the ultimate expert on agricultural sustainability, practical, authentic, biographically rooted in agriculture. And then the pitching entrepreneurs basically align themselves or their startup sustainability vision with this hypothetical viewpoint of the imagined farmer. What I also find striking about this move is that it somehow mirrors, at least to some extent, how many critical agri-food scholars in our own academic circles position themselves as allies or translators for marginalized farmers. The only difference is that the scholars, come from a different community of practice. But this is just a side note. Returning to the two-step method, as I said, in the second step, pitching entrepreneurs align themselves with the figure of the farmer, usually, as in this case, through biographical or professional references. And this creates an interactional arrangement in which the startup sustainability narrative is not only supported anecdotally, but also morally elevated. What counts as sustainable here is not what's in the pitch deck or what investors might want to hear, but what the farmers supposedly think. As mentioned before, to me, this is a striking example of what François Corin and colleagues refer to as organizational ventriloquism, the process by which organizations speak through invoked figures or voices deemed authoritative in order to legitimize their own claims. In this case, the startup speaks as if through the farmer, using this stylized figure to anchor its sustainability narrative, making it appear both grounded and credible, while at the same time carefully aligned with the expectations of venture capital. And the third method I call demonstration, inspired by the work of the French sociologist Claude Rosenthal. As already mentioned, Rosenthal conceptualizes demonstrations as practices that unfold along a spectrum between showing and proving, that is, between performative display and methodologically grounded evidence of technological effectiveness. This spectrum was clearly observable in my sample of startup pitches at Agritechnica, but with a striking imbalance. Nearly all startups were highly skilled at showing that they were developing a sustainable technology. This was done, for example, through computer renderings of agricultural robots in lush green fields or through physical devices exhibited directly on stage. And maybe also as another side note, the figure here only shows a very small selection of all the artifacts that were shown on stage, but one could easily develop a much more fine-grained typology of how pitching entrepreneurs mobilized material props as part of their demonstrations. Just zooming in on the subcategory of technologies, for instance, we could differentiate between prototypes, market-ready products, and updated versions of existing products. And as we move further along the spectrum toward proof, we encounter so-called user metrics, such as absolute user numbers. And these were also invoked in many pitches, likely because they are relatively easy to generate using mainstream tools from big tech providers like Google Analytics. However, as I already mentioned, scientific evidence in the narrower sense was a rare exception in the pitches. In fact, only one startup presented data from a controlled comparative study conducted in collaboration with the University of Bonn and several German public agricultural research centers. In sum, especially when we draw a comparison to the historical origins of the concept of sustainability in scientific forestry in Prussia, we see a clear shift in how truth is enacted in these pitches. The vast majority of startups operated in a register that could be labeled as truth as appearance or truth as showing rather than truth as proof, when demonstrating their allegedly sustainable technologies. So, and this brings me to my conclusions. In conclusion, my study shows that sustainability is not a clearly separable non-economic value that can simply be inserted into the pitch. Rather, integrating sustainability into the pitch is an interactional achievement. Entrepreneurs must carefully balance their sustainability claims bold enough to attract investors, but not so bold as to alienate them. And through the practices of sustainabilization, credibilization, and demonstration, one could extend my argument. I know it's not the best style to insert new theory in the end, but somehow it fitted very well. So these three interactional methods could be interpreted as through three ways of changing sustainability discourse. Sustainabilization redefines what sustainability means in the context of venture capitalism. Credibilization determines who is authorized to speak credibly about sustainability, and demonstration changes how sustainability is presented as true, emphasizing appearances over scientific proof. Yeah, and with these conclusions, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Cornelius. So, without further ado, I would hand over to Peter Feindt as a discussant for this session. And Peter is a professor of agricultural and food policy at Humboldt University and a highly respected scholar in the fields of sustainability, transitions, environmental governance, and agri-food politics. He was trained as a political scientist and has held positions at Wageningen University, Cardiff University, and the University of Hamburg, and also serves on several high-level advisory boards, including the German Bioeconomy Council and the DFG's Senate Commission on Agricultural and Food System. In addition to his academic work, he is an experienced policy facilitator and has contributed extensively to public dialogue on sustainability agriculture. So if you turn on the TV in Germany, you will sooner or later see Peter being interviewed about something farmer related or agriculture related. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Johannes, for that. Today, we've delegated the interview to Pascal Grohmann, who will actually explain how the multi-annual financial framework might affect Brandenburg's farmers. Let's see whether the high respect will continue for another 15 minutes. I'll start with some expectation management. So my responses here are completely spontaneously because I haven't seen the presentations before. I have followed with much interest the work of the Biomaterialities Project over the last 6 years, and I've been very impressed by the research that has been done, by the very productive output, and also by the significant insights that have been produced. And I hope that much of that will be contained in further academic discourses and will also trickle down into societal and political debates. So I hope that all members of the biomateriality teams will continue to have great academic or practitioner or policy careers. We will see. Okay. Today, I should also disclose that my main academic training is actually in economics. So therefore, I tend to have a little bit of an economic perspective on the kind of questions that we are discussing today, although I haven't really published anything in economics because I then later retrained myself into a political scientist or interdisciplinary social scientist. First of all, I think two great presentations today, very grateful. And I have also been admiring, Zara, your kind of multitasking here with your caring duties and contributing to academic discourse. So I think what both presentations have, you take a, let's say, discourse analytical perspective on major structural transformative changes in food systems. And the nature of these transformative changes are that they somehow link developments in different, what I would call societal subsystems, like technology, financing, market development, agriculture, which are then also linked to kind of everyday practices like diets and food practices. And all of this is mediated through a large number of actors with very differential power. And the actors to which you are alluding in your presentations are kind of technological corporations and corporations in the financial sector. But there are also other very important actors that play a big role here. If you, for example, think about the role of the retail sector in shaping the kind of products that are available and also then in selecting the production methods that can be used to produce products that make it onto the shelves. Yeah? So there are various important actors who have a power to affect choices and make structural selections. So with the focus, or what does the focus on the discursive element allow us to do? It allows us to see how these structural developments are represented and partly also driven by the creation of narratives with a strategic use. I think that was very clear in both presentations. Sarah, in your presentation, yeah, the financialization, so the creation of narratives which create is description of the situation that requires technological solutions, which can only be achieved by the mobilization of large amounts of financial capital. And in the case of Cornelius, that's the same. Yeah, the pitching of solutions for elite societal problems in order to generate interest by, your case, venture capitalists. Yeah. What's interesting in both cases is the link between, let's say, the profit motive. Yeah, in both cases, we have companies and people who want to mobilize economic resources because in the end, they either want to make a profit or they want to be able to pay people who can do some work for them. And that, let's say, this profit and income motivation is then linked to promises about solutions to societal problems, yeah? Sustainability, food security, sustainable food provision for a growing global population. And it's also interesting that this kind of framing is then, for some reason, I now see myself on a large screen. Don't like that. I'm not sure why
Yeah,
that
I also
happened.
noticed that. I
That
didn't do
was
anything.
me. Sorry.
Did you pin Peter?
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
Okay.
can you
Do you want?
redo that?
Yeah. Can you
I'd like to see
unpin
the
him?
audience then. Yeah, that's much better. Thanks. Good. So it's also interesting that this kind of framing can be reproduced at different scales. Yeah. From the global scale, yeah, we have to feed 10 billion people to kind of solutions for more regional sustainability problems in relation to the production of foodstuffs. I can very much follow the reconstruction of the narratives and the discursive strategies and also their purposes. I think that's a very rigid analysis. But what I was wondering was, first of all, is the analysis finished with the reconstruction of these narratives or these performative strategies? What is the broader purpose? And for both presentations, I had the impression that there is a much broader academic and maybe also much broader political agenda behind the analysis that's expressed in the claim that this is a critical analysis. And critical analysis means, well, we want to put a spotlight on the underlying unarticulated assumptions. And of course, that's to open up a space where we can discuss alternative solutions. Yeah? So it's against a presentation of things as being, yeah, Sachzwänge or without alternatives. So I was therefore wondering, I mean, my own socialization into critical theory has been very much linked to the second and third Frankfurt School. And here the concept of the argument is quite central. Just to mention Jürgen Habermas and his work. And Frank Fischer has elaborated that. So he has translated Habermas' work into the project of a critical policy analysis, where the analysis of the narratives is only an intermediate step. And the next step in the analysis would then be to reconstruct the underlying arguments and the validity claims implicit in these arguments, so that we can then ask, okay, what is the relevant context to which the argument or the narrative is actually alluding, to allow the claim that this is a valid argument. And only that step allows us to get a better understanding of the underlying structural presuppositions. And only that step allows us to understand whether that is a very rigid structure or one that is fluid, and also to get a better understanding where problematic structures can potentially be challenged and where their vulnerabilities are, or also their internal contradictions. Now, if we take that argumentative perspective, I think what is really interesting is that in both cases, we have economic financialization narratives where we would say, okay, yeah, that's standard economic practice. Yeah, you try to get capital owners interested in potential business opportunities. But the interesting thing is that these pitches, these narratives are then aligned with, on the one hand, critical stories about the sustainability of our economy. So some kind of green project or maybe green modernity, and looking at the vocabulary, even progressivist narratives. Yeah? And that's quite interesting because it creates, or it's kind of crossing traditional narratives or traditional discursive boundaries. And that is something that we could discover already, I mean, with the original Apple pitch. Yeah? Apple or Google, all these companies in the early days of the exploding internet were presenting themselves as forces of the societal good, yeah, as creators of inclusive communities. Of course, this has now been a little bit dismantled, seeing how these corporations have developed and how they ruthlessly exercise economic and political power. But it might be quite interesting also to explore this, whether this is just purely instrumental use of certain narratives that, and then the underlying question is, okay, why do investors or pitchers think that this resonates? Or is there also some kind of internal belief, or does this also have an effect on the direction of the innovations? That leads to a second current area, and that's the question about the interplay of technological innovations and sustainability transitions. And here we've got some really interesting publications that discuss the directionality of innovation fields. So if you've got a technology like, let's say, the digital or different digital technologies and their applications in agricultural production, these technologies can be used for very different purposes. The question is, of course, what are the framework conditions that influence decision makers, whether they develop digital applications that merely maximize, let's say, profit for farmers, or do they also offer sustainability benefits? Now, the storyline in both of your presentations is, of course, that is pitched here, is that sustainability is also the better economic solution. Now, the question is that true or not? That completely depends on the economic framework conditions. If we have framework conditions where, for example, we have a really stiff price tag on greenhouse gas emissions, then the more sustainable solution will also be the more economic one. If we don't get a proper greenhouse gas emission market off the ground, then that will not be the case. So the question is then here whether the appeal to sustainability as being a good business or a business opportunity that very much depends on the expectations of the economic and regulatory framework conditions in the future. And that is then a question about transformation strategies at the societal level. So we can then use these pitches or these narratives, Zara, in your investment prospects that you've analyzed, to look at the underlying assumptions or the underlying narratives about the development of the framework conditions with regard to the possible sustainability transformation at societal level. A final point that I want to make is that I would like to hear a little bit more about your underlying theory of society and technology. So if you analyze these performative practices, or if you analyze these narratives in strategic corporate communication, is that just a second or third order phenomenon where people just communicate about underlying things which maybe not affect very much the underlying dynamics, financial dynamics of technological development? Or are these genuine basic phenomena of societal change in a situation of transition? And in both presentations, that was not quite clear to me. And it was also not quite clear to me into which broader theories of society you are embedding your arguments. And so I would like to hear a little bit more about that. And that is particularly important, again, from the original ambition of a critical theory, which had the intention to, I mean, it was originally in the Frankfurt School linked to a concept of a new second school of enlightenment, where you try to demonstrate that certain societal structures can be changed and that they are pervaded by power structures and underlying assumptions. And by putting the focus on these myths and narratives, etc., to demonstrate that they have been created, that they are human creations, which might be changed through human interventions. So the question is then, or my reconstruction of that program would be the ideas of reflexive societal steering, which is then supported by a reflexive policy analysis or reflexive analysis of these technological practices. But that raises the question, okay, what are then the relevant steering mechanisms which decide whether certain technologies are being used or not and for what purposes? And which decide whether these new technological opportunities are really being used for sustainability benefit, or whether they will just lead to another round of further intensification of the use of natural resources to enhance profit for, let's say, transnational investors or corporate investors. So this would be my 2 cents, and I'm very much looking forward to hear a little bit more about your perspectives. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and for allowing me to join this event.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for these remarks. I would suggest that we give a chance to the speakers. Maybe Sarah first and then Cornelius, in the order in which the presentations were given, to respond to Peter's remarks and maybe to each other as well. And in the meantime, if you want to say something, you can already raise your hands. We'll start a queue.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you have secretly already listened to our presentations in the future and then started to write down your comments, because I can't imagine how you would have come up with all of that so spontaneously. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd be very happy to have this as much of an interactive dialogue as is possible in this virtual space. So I would just start maybe by trying to respond to some of your questions, and then Cornelius, please jump in, or we can combine it, and then of course have others jump in as well. So I think just to to maybe comment on one of your first points, right? That this is mostly, or that this analysis of narratives is really and should just be a first step, right? And that completely is. So I think it's my work somehow preceded a little bit what Cornelius has done, in the sense that I mostly analyze these discourses here that at some point in time were somehow emerging. They were to some extent relatively new within this agri-food scene, and they were interesting in the sense that they were presenting something new within the agri-food sector, but not necessarily within the financial sector as such, or the entire pitching scene that, of course, is much bigger, and people have been pitching to venture capital for much longer than ag tech and food tech solutions being somehow promoted there. So I think that's definitely really important to say, well, we first somehow, as agri-food scholars, I guess, critical agri-food scholars, became interested in what is going on here, and we're much engaging with these narratives and discourses that we could find. But then we shouldn't stop at that point, and we need exactly what Cornelius, I believe, and others as well have been doing since, is this kind of empirically grounded research, then in the sense what is actually happening with these technologies, with these pitches, with the capital that is being invested, etc., and so on. And I think, to me, it's quite fascinating also to see that to some extent there are these bubbles, right? These rhetorical bubbles. They come up, they are hyped for a certain amount of time, and then they somehow disappear again, or maybe all the promises and all the moonshots that are being suggested that this industry is going to undertake, then in the end they don't necessarily really materialize, and lots of money somehow goes into these sectors, into the startups, but it also partly just disappears. And it's interesting also to see that more recently investments have actually quite dropped, and investors might have realized maybe that it's maybe not such a lucrative investment, right? And then at the same time, the VCs are trying to make the opposite point or reposition it and say, oh, well, we haven't seen really this much success yet, but it's maybe due to X, Y, Z, etc. So we really need to, engage in a much more comprehensive way and follow the capital investments, the actual material productions that are there, etc., and what this means, and also for the actual realization of new technological means that we might have then for agricultural food. And then just a little bit on that. So I've been, in my own work, I've been trying to do that to some extent as well over the past few years. And one component that I thought was really quite interesting also was to look at a way of, or a cluster, a hub of technology, or several hubs of technology production. So this rhetorical or narrative analysis is mostly, as I said, the analysis of these, like the driving or the main actors were mostly US-based, Silicon Valley kind of style narratives. And I've been following up that research a little bit with some research into the Wageningen, so-called Food Valley, where I had a graduate student who's been conducting some research there. And it's interesting to see how this pitching model and a lot of the Silicon Valley rhetoric has been implemented there as well, while at the same time being combined with the power of the incumbents, large agricultural, agri-food business corporations that are quite powerful at Wageningen as well. So that's an interesting example to follow up. And then in Germany, you might be familiar or not, I don't know, with the Agro-Tech Valley in the region of Osnabrück, which is also digital technology development hub to some extent, but mostly driven by completely different actors. And mostly these machinery producers from the German Mittelstand. So like mid-range companies who have been also trying to digitize mostly these machineries. And what was interesting to me coming out of that research was that VC venture capital and startups, even though they had like a small incubator as well, but otherwise startups and venture capital was completely irrelevant to this kind of technology development cluster. So I think this really is important. So one, to follow up what's actually happening with these financial investments, and at the same time to also put it in the bigger context of technological in development, then again in the sense of, okay, but who is actually, or who are the other actors? Who is also then funding this? And this brings me to some extent to what you called, I think, the economic framework conditions, which are very, very different, of course, in all these different situations. So, of course, within the European context, we have a different economic framework condition than in the US, allowing for other means, other ways of technology production to be funded, I guess, and other means of accessing capital that is not necessarily just financial capital or venture capital in that sense. So yeah, so it indeed needs to be put into the bigger context, and followed up with more empirical research, also to specifically, I guess, answer this question or try to respond to this question that you also brought up, which I think is very fundamental, that technologies can be made and used for very, very different purposes. And of course, maybe one technology that was developed with a specific purpose of generating a specific financial return might eventually end up being used in a completely different way. That this might not generate this purpose, this financial income stream for investors, but maybe it's doing something completely different. So I think that is really also fascinating and important to bear in mind as well, that it's, at least from my understanding, it's not fixed, right? We have open outcomes open pathways, maybe trajectories of technological use. And I guess just as the last response, or trying to respond then a little bit to this underlying theory of society and technology in my case, this exactly already speaks to that. So I would consider technologies as something that is to some extent open. So the relationship between society and technologies is and mutually influenced by openness, by societal ideas and means, narratives being created surrounding technologies, while at the same time they are not inherently fixed in terms of that they have some sort of, I don't know, fixed position that they take, but it's a mutual interaction where the two somehow can, to some extent, be developed and further influenced by each other. And there is a certain openness and unexpectedness, I guess, between the two. While at the same time, of course, we do see that there are, I guess we understand that there are power imbalances in terms of who is funding technologies, who can use them, who has maybe more power over steering the economic framework conditions in a certain direction or not. So I guess where I'm coming from would be a combination of more classic political economy perspectives in terms of the power relations that we are engaging with, both in regard to technology development and here also the food system, and then bringing in some more of the science and technology informed perspectives in terms of trying to not have it already completely fixed and closed, but keeping it open and practice and actor oriented. So that's my 2 cents as a brief response to all these great points that you made. And I'm going to hand over to Cornelius.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for your questions, and thank you, Sarah, also for yeah, for responding first, which also gave me the time to order my thoughts to your very rich comments a bit, Peter. And maybe also a few words. I also really liked how our two presentations work together. You kind of sketching the broader imaginaries in which these financialized forms of technological innovation occur, and then me zooming a little bit into the nitty-gritty empirical details. So I like this very much. Yeah, and to your questions, I would like to begin with my answer to the question of narratives, because yeah, I think because you also asked the question, does it really stop with the analysis of narratives? And there's somebody who wants to enter. I will shortly admit. Yeah, and I think. For me, I wouldn't say it does stop with the analysis of narratives. And this is also, I think, at least maybe this did not come across, but I wanted to go a little bit further in terms of also alluding to the kind of material order of the pitch. And I think this is also where Foucault becomes or Foucault's conceptualization of discourse becomes important, because for Foucault, discourse is not only kind of the spoken word, but also discourse is kind of materialized in institutions and even inscribed into bodies, for example. No, I'm not even like in the current version of the paper, I'm not even working a lot with Foucault, but I think in the revision, I have to weave this in somehow. But I think this is also something that I want to do in the paper to kind of show, yes, kind of the entrepreneurs have to certain rules of politeness. And also in my interview data, I was asking the people I was interviewing, yeah, it's interesting, you all talk about sustainability, but why? But one thing that was striking to me, that nobody is criticizing the the big companies, which is some kind of a rhetorical question. Of course, it's understandable that they don't criticize these companies, but yeah, the answer by the entrepreneur was also telling, because she told me, yeah, of course, I mean, if you do that, you will never receive venture capital funding. You will never receive that. So there is kind of this, on the narrative level, there is this form of kind of self-correction, no? But then on the other hand, I also want to show, and maybe I do this in the paper a little bit more in depth, that there is also material order to the pitch. For example, we can talk about how the pitch is spatially set up. No, there is a stage, and there is a mic, and usually the venture capitalists are sitting in the front row. So also the venture capitalists are kind of materially enacted as the ultimate authority in terms of agricultural sustainability. And so this is what I describe a little bit more in my paper, how the whole material order of the pitch is organized about the figure of the venture capitalist. One could also talk about the kind of the temporal order of the pitch. For example, entrepreneurs are asked, and this is also what, if you look at, for example, how to pitch tutorials of famous startup accelerators like the Y Combinator, they tell you you have to be very brief, because venture capitalists have a very limited attention span. So kind of the shortness of your pitch is actually kind of a sign of quality, and that you're very deep into your topic, because you can actually, so there is not only these kind of narrative level, but I would say a much more deeper level that I would like to demonstrate with my findings. And maybe I do this a little bit better in yeah, so this is with regard to the question on narratives. And but it's also a nice link to the question about alternatives, no? Because you said, yeah, it doesn't end there, and it necessarily kind of this form of critique necessarily leads to the follow-up question, what would be alternatives? And actually, this is a question or that I pose myself all the time, because I always get in, also my PhD thesis was somehow I showed how this startup that I was analyzing heavily transformed under the influence of venture capitalists, and the big ideals they had in the beginning shifted somehow, and now they are selling pesticides on behalf of a large corporation. So the question about alternatives. So because, and we also discussed this at my intervention at Grüne Woche, where you also were present. Are there kind of alternatives to venture capital financing for innovation. And I'm not, yeah, I think I cannot really give an answer to this question. I think I might also have to choose a different empirical object, a little bit more like Luisa Prause in her research, who was also part of the biomaterialities group, who really looks at like activist collectives that, or I think Alina, you are also doing that, right? Looking at like activist collectives who are trying to develop alternatives to these kind of financialized ways of how innovation is being developed. Yeah, and this is true. This is really an answer that I cannot really give. What I try to do, because you also mentioned the notion of strategic, and I'm a little bit kind of hesitant of using this notion that kind of all the narratives that pitching entrepreneurs are delivering in their pitches are strategic. For example, I also have little moments in the pitches. This is a nice example that I always cite. There's one, the person has a background in science, and the startup of the person is developing a technology that is improving satellite images of fields. And the service that the startup is offering is basically removing clouds from these satellite images to enhance the quality of the data. And then in his pitch, he was like, yeah, and it's actually impossible to quantify the sustainability impact of cloudless data, but I will do it anyways. With cloudless data, you can save so many gigatons of water or etc. So I think it's not always strategic. Sometimes it's also kind of subconscious, or they are in a very ambivalent situation there. They have to undertake this balancing act of making bold sustainability claims on the one hand and not stepping on the investor's toes on the other. And I think what I'm interested is in, so I feel quite empathetic with these pitching entrepreneurs, and I think for them it's a terribly tricky situation to be in. No, so I think the question that interests me rather than the question of alternatives is the tensions under which entrepreneurs act in this world that they are thrown into. Sometimes they don't even, for example, the people that I studied in my PhD dissertation, I think in the beginning they didn't really know what they were getting into, and then they were in the startup world, and then you are asked, yeah, please give us a pitch, be short, because otherwise the investors will lose interest. So it's kind of, so instead of the question of alternatives, I think I'm more interested in the what are the subjects that are being produced and under which tensions do these subjects have to operate. And then maybe as a last point, the question of societal order. In this sense, like Harold Garfinkel is extremely radical. I mean, not radical in his political viewpoints, but his conception of society is super radical. And it very much inspired many people in the ANT, actor network theory tradition, etc. Basically, he says society, there is no superordinate structure of society, or there is no societal order. Societal order is enacted in practice over and over again. So kind of my move of conceptualizing the pitch as a device of venture capitalization is basically also an answer to, well, how does this order of venture capitalization, how does it spread? No? And then the argument is a little bit, well, the device comes with certain features. You always have the stage, you always have the certain temporal order, etc. And this is how a certain part of societal order is being reproduced. And then maybe this could be another answer to the alternatives question, because it actually poses a question: can new technology or radically new technology actually emerge if we think about the emergence of technology in terms of pitches? And I also find this interesting because now recently as a researcher, we are also more and more often asked to deliver a pitch. For example, at this intervention at the Grüne Woche, I wasn't asked to deliver kind of a critical intervention on my views on, I don't know, financialized innovation in agriculture. I was asked to deliver a pitch. So in a sense, this kind of startup logic is actually spreading into other parts of society, and it's kind of entering into the ways we think about innovation and change and socio-technical transitions. But this is not a thought that I have developed in depth. It was just a kind of spontaneous thought. Yeah, I think this would be my question, my answer to your questions. Thank you very much again. Also very impressive how you spontaneously came up with all these very intriguing questions. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. If I may quickly respond to your final remark, the Garfinkel approach. I can follow that to a certain degree, that we say, okay, it's interesting to see how social order is reenacted in everyday or situational interactions. When we talk about the future of agri-food, I would be concerned that this is missing out on one important element of society, that we rely on highly specialized sets of institutions and practices. You could call them functional subsystems, whether you want to buy into that or not, in order to provide certain functions or services in a reliable way. Yeah, I mean, think about the financial system. If the financial system stops operating in a reliable way, that has serious consequences for starting with the conditions under which everyday life is working, but also living conditions, equality, inequality, justice. If we think about the justice system, if that stops operating in a regular way, it has serious consequences. So our democratic and open societies rely on, let's call these functional subsystems. I also have critical perspectives on that theory, but I think there's an important point here. And the question is then, underlying this narrative about the potential that our food systems will not be able to feed 10 billion people in a sustainable way in the long run. That is a very functional argument. And the question then is, if we take up that systemic perspective, is indeed how can the food systems of the future look like? And so I think we need probably a certain degree of that perspective to see, okay, this is not just solved at the level of everyday or situational interactions and encounters. But that's just as a short remark.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe if I may also shortly respond to that, because I'm not a kind of a radical proponent of ethnomethodology, and I just took it maybe as a method, but I'm a very big fan of like sociological microanalysis and like qualitative microanalysis, and also a big fan of Irving Goffman, who also built on Garfinkel to develop his concept of the interaction order. No, so he basically says, like from this Garfinkelian thinking. So I think I wouldn't say that like Goffman and Garfinkel are opposed to the fact that there are kind of, or maybe they wouldn't say that there are societal subsystems, but I think they would say that there are certain kind of orders and, for example, democracy. But they would say like democracy. They would say, I guess, democracy is enacted in situated practice over and over again. No, but maybe to get a little bit away from this kind of abstract debates, there's also a very, very interesting paper by Karin Knorr-Cetina, also a very big figure in German STS sociology of finance. And she wrote an amazing paper about stock exchange markets, so also a type of financial market. And there she makes the argument of a global interaction order. And basically, she does a micro-sociological analysis of people on the trading floor in front of their desks and interacting with people at the other end of the world via a chat. And in these kind of protocols of the chats, she identifies what she calls a global interaction order. And basically, the displays of the computers are her window into, like, her micro sociological window into this kind of more global, more structural, more systemic interactions. And this is a little bit, but I didn't make this point, how I see startup pitches. Because, for example, there are also a lot of kind of sociology of finance work about high frequency trading, or like where people look at like computer displays and they see all these numbers, they see what is happening in the world, etc. But if we compare this to kind of venture capital markets, from my point, and this is not meant disrespectfully, but they are kind of primitive markets, no, because there are not these kind of high frequency trading algorithms, super technologized. They are relatively analog because you always have this pitch setting. And as Sarah Ruth also said, like the pitch is there since a long time. And if you interact, and it's happening over and over again. So kind of my claim is the pitch could also be understood as a window into this larger interaction order of VC markets. But yeah, maybe this is a little bit, yeah, too far.
All right, as a moderator, it is my role to point out that we have about 3 minutes left. So if there are any pressing questions, then I would very much encourage you to ask them now. And if there aren't, then I would give the last word to Sarah. So anybody? Guess not. So yeah, floor is yours.
Nobody else? No? Last chance. Sorry, I think we've already talked a lot as the presenters in this session. I just wanted to add to this super interesting conversation, which I'd love to continue at some point. We do not just have these, how did you call this? Societal subsections, which are actually very relevant if they fail or if something happens, they're very real consequences. But as we're engaging with agriculture and food, we also have this material component, which I think is super interesting in the sense that there are certain materialities that are still really relevant within agriculture production and food that cannot just be pitched away, so to say. And I think a lot of the failures of the agri-tech businesses and the big ventures and so on that we've seen, I think are partly also related to these biomaterial components. And I think that's another additional aspect just to integrate into the discussion. And what makes the agri-food tech scene in that sense maybe unique and distinguishes it from other areas that would have been pitched to venture capitalists and the financial sector more generally before that or currently. So I think that's for me at least also a fascinating question to pursue further.
Yes, maybe I would also very much like to continue the conversation. For me, time flew by, so I didn't even notice that. We took all the time for potential questions. Yeah, but if should there like questions or reactions in the audience, you can also drop me a mail, and we can kind of continue discussing about these matters. From my side, thank you again, everyone. We will continue. I will take a quick look at the program. Yeah, at 6 p.m. Until then, with the next session, why and how should we engage with the materiality of technology? The session was organized by Miriam, and we have again very kind of very interesting speakers and discussants. And we would be happy to see a few of you also in the other session. But happy to continue the conversation also via other channels. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right,
And
thanks everybody.
we stay online for a short moment. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you,
Take
Peter.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Bye-bye.
for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah.
Stopp mal die Aufnahme gerade.
Ja, Moment, mache ich.